It's easy to think that organized religion started with temples and priests, but what if we've got it all wrong? What if the roots of faith go back much further, to a time when humans weren't even settled in cities yet? The earliest evidence of religious practice doesn't come from cathedrals or pyramids, but from caves. Yes, caves. Let's talk about shamanism, the oldest known form of spiritual practice in human history. We're talking about rituals going back 30,000 years or more. Think about that. Long before we had written language, before we had agriculture, before even the first cities, humans were engaging in complex religious ceremonies. What does that tell us? That humanity has always been deeply connected to something beyond the physical world, or at least they thought they were. Archaeological evidence from places like the Lascaux caves in France shows stunning depictions of figures wearing animal skins and antlers. But these weren't just hunters showing off their kills. These were shamans, spiritual leaders of their tribes who were believed to communicate with the spirit world. Now here's where it gets interesting. These shamans didn't just pray, they became the animals, the spirits, the forces of nature. Through trance-like states, they claimed to step into another reality. So, were they prophets, or were they delusional? That's the question we have to face. Consider this, shamanistic practices weren't isolated to one corner of the world. You find similar rituals in Siberia, North America, South Africa, and Australia. Cultures that had no contact with each other were independently practicing some form of shamanism. Is that a coincidence, or does it point to something deeper in human consciousness? Shamans didn't just provide spiritual guidance, they also had immense power over their people. They could decide when to hunt, when to migrate, and even who lived or died based on their supposed communications with the spirit world. Were these early humans simply in or of their natural surroundings, or were they being manipulated by individuals claiming to have divine connections? Imagine living in a world where someone tells you, if we don't make this sacrifice, the spirits will take your child. Is that faith, or is it madness? And let's not forget the use of hallucinogenic plants. Many shamans entered altered states of consciousness using natural substances. In today's world, that would be considered drug use, maybe even psychosis. But in ancient times, it was seen as a doorway to another realm. Does that make their experiences any less real? Or are we quick to dismiss what we can't scientifically explain? Then there's the question of survival. Did shamanism help early humans make sense of a terrifying and chaotic world, or did it imprison them in a cycle of superstition and fear? After all, if you believe the spirits control the weather, your food supply, and your health, you're not exactly in control of your own life. You're at the mercy of forces you can't see or prove. And yet, this was the foundation of what would eventually evolve into modern religion. From these early cave rituals to the birth of polytheism and monotheism, shamanism was the seed. Is that seed the root of all human spirituality? Or is it proof that from the very beginning, religion was based on an irrational, fear-driven need to explain the unexplainable? Some will argue that these early humans were tapping into something real, an unseen realm that we've lost touch with in our modern, scientifically minded world. Others will say that shamanism was the first step down a long path of delusion, a primitive form of control that has persisted for millennia. When people talk about ancient civilizations, the Maya are usually mentioned for their incredible achievements, massive pyramids, a calendar so accurate it caused an apocalypse scare in 2012, and advanced mathematics. But let's cut through the awe for a moment and talk about something way darker, the Maya's obsession with human sacrifice. Yeah, these people didn't just leave behind some of the most beautiful cities in the world, they also left behind a legacy of blood, and lots of it. Here's the deal for the Maya: sacrifice wasn't just a ritual, it was a necessity. They believed the gods had created the world and continued to sustain it. But there was a catch: the gods needed something in return. That something was human blood. Without it, the sun might stop rising, the rains might stop falling, and crops would wither. So, they weren't sacrificing people for fun, they were literally trying to keep the universe running. But at what cost? The Maya believed that their gods had given life through their own blood, so human blood was the only thing that could repay the debt. And when we say human sacrifice, we're not talking about a quiet little ceremony in the woods. This was a public spectacle. Picture this: massive stone pyramids, packed with spectators, drums pounding, and at the top, a priest driving a blade into a living, breathing human being. All of it done with the belief that this act of violence was necessary to keep the cosmic order intact. And here's the kicker: they didn't just sacrifice prisoners of war. Sure, captives were the obvious choice, but there were times when the Maya sacrificed their own elites, people of status, kings, priests. Imagine that your ruler, the person meant to guide your civilization, being offered up to the gods. That's not just faith, that's faith taken to an extreme that we can barely comprehend today. What kind of society does that? But why did they believe this was necessary? The Maya saw the world as being in a constant state of peril. Everything, the sun, the rain, the very soil they depended on, could stop functioning if the gods weren't satisfied. Their cosmology was a cycle of creation and destruction, life and death, and human beings were the currency that kept the gods' favor. It's a terrifying worldview, really. How do you argue with a religion that says if you don't spill blood, the entire universe might collapse? Let's talk about the logistics for a second. This wasn't a rare occurrence. We're talking about regular human sacrifices at major events, everything from the crowning of a new king to the dedication of a new temple. In fact, the ball game the Maya played, pits, where teams tried to knock a rubber ball through a stone hoop, wasn't just a sport. It was a death match. The losers, or sometimes the winners, depending on the interpretation, were often sacrificed. That's right, their national pastime had a body count. Now, some people argue that human sacrifice wasn't as common as it seems, that it was reserved for specific, high-stakes occasions. But there's no denying the archaeological evidence: skeletons with their hearts cut out, decapitated skulls, and inscriptions depicting priests with blood-soaked hands. It's clear that human sacrifice was a central part of Maya religious life. The question is, was this devotion to the gods, or was it a society spiraling into madness? And here's another thing to consider: this wasn't a one-off event in history. The Maya civilization thrived for nearly 2 millennia, and human sacrifice was part of that entire journey. So, was it working for them? In their eyes, it probably was. Crops were growing, cities were expanding, and the Maya became one of the most dominant civilizations in Mesoamerica. In their minds, the blood was doing its job. But is this the ultimate example of faith, or is it a chilling reminder of how far humans will go to maintain control over forces they can't understand? The real shocker is that this wasn't just about survival, it was about power. The Maya elite controlled the rituals, and by performing these sacrifices, they reinforced their authority. Think about it. If you're the guy who talks to the gods and makes sure the sun rises tomorrow, people are going to listen to you. But does that make the whole thing any less insane? Were they truly serving the gods, or were they exploiting a fear-driven belief system to maintain power over the masses? It's easy to look back and dismiss this as barbaric, but for the Maya, this was life. This was the price of survival in a world they believed was fragile and easily tipped into chaos. Their entire cosmology demanded sacrifice, and without it, everything would fall apart. So, where does that leave us? Was Mayan human sacrifice an act of ultimate devotion, proving just how far people will go to ensure the survival of their world? Or was it a tragic example of how belief systems can lead to horrifying extremes? When you think about the gods of ancient civilizations, it's easy to imagine wise and benevolent beings overseeing the world. But the Sumerians, the creators of one of the earliest known religions, worshipped a pantheon that was anything but peaceful or sane by today's standards. Their gods weren't just overseeing the natural order, they were erratic, emotional, and sometimes downright terrifying. Let's start with Anu, the king of the gods. You'd think he'd be a wise ruler, right? Well, not exactly. Anu was a god of the sky who mostly distanced himself from the affairs of both humans and the other gods. Yet, his influence was massive, and he held absolute authority over life and death. Anu's detachment, combined with his occasional interventions, made him an unpredictable figure. The Sumerians lived in fear of his wrath, wondering when he might step in to hurl down a plague or drought. Is this the kind of deity you'd put your trust in? Or does it sound more like an unstable force you'd be scared to upset? Then, there's Enlil, the god of wind, storms, and chaos, Anu's right-hand deity, if you will. Enlil's story is a wild ride of destruction and power plays. He once became so enraged with humanity that he unleashed a flood to wipe everyone out, a story that should sound familiar if you've ever heard of Noah's Ark. But here's the twist. In Sumerian mythology, Enlil wasn't saving anyone or offering redemption. He was just angry and didn't want to deal with humanity's noise anymore. Total destruction was his solution. But Enlil's not the only volatile one in this pantheon. Enter Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and fertility. She's a fascinating character, both alluring and terrifying. Inanna wasn't just about beauty and attraction. She was also a fierce warrior goddess known for her ruthless ambitions. She even attempted to overthrow the underworld itself and challenge its ruler, Ereshkigal, in what can only be described as a power grab. Inanna's mythology is filled with betrayal, vengeance, and outright insanity, often leaving death and destruction in her wake. Here's the kicker. These weren't just mythological stories for the Sumerians. They believed their gods were very real and had direct influence over their daily lives. Imagine living in a society where every natural disaster, illness, or personal tragedy could be attributed to a god's whim. Does that sound like the kind of divine order you'd expect from higher beings? Or does it sound like a system built on fear and unpredictability? What's even more fascinating is how these gods mirror human emotions and flaws. They were jealous, petty, and often cruel. If you think the modern concept of God is based on benevolence and justice, the Sumerian gods stand in stark contrast. These deities weren't concerned with fairness or morality. They acted in their own self-interest, often to the detriment of humanity. And yet, the Sumerians offered their loyalty, their prayers, and their sacrifices to these volatile figures. Was this a desperate attempt to maintain order in a chaotic world, or were they victims of divine manipulation? The Sumerians also believed in the importance of maintaining balance with these gods, but that balance was always precarious. The gods didn't hesitate to bring disaster if they felt disrespected or ignored. Enlil's flood wasn't a one-off event. Plagues, storms, and warfare were all considered divine punishments for human misdeeds. But here's the irony. The gods themselves were often the ones acting irresponsibly. We could look at this and say the Sumerians were trying to make sense of a world they didn't fully understand, a world where natural disasters, disease, and war felt like random, uncontrollable forces. But instead of seeing these forces as part of a natural order, they attributed them to the whims of insane gods. Or perhaps there's something deeper here, were the Sumerian gods actually symbolic of human rulers, projecting the flaws and fears of ancient kings onto their deities? If the gods were selfish, cruel, and erratic, maybe it's because the Sumerians were living under rulers who were exactly the same. We've all heard about the grandeur of ancient Egypt, pharaohs, pyramids, mummies, but behind all that splendor lies something far more bizarre, the Egyptians' obsession with the afterlife. And by obsession, I mean they lived and died for it. Literally. The Egyptians didn't just believe in an afterlife. They believed in an insanely complex one, filled with gods, monsters, trials, and some seriously strange rituals. To them, death wasn't an end, it was the beginning of a treacherous journey through the underworld, a journey that only the wealthy and well-prepared could hope to survive. So, how did they prepare? By spending most of their lives building elaborate tombs, hoarding treasures, and mummifying their bodies with such precision that their techniques are still studied by scientists today. But here's the question. Were they simply planning for an afterlife, or were they prisoners of an irrational fear? Let's get into it. To the ancient Egyptians, the soul wasn't a simple, singular thing. It was fragmented into multiple parts, the Ka, the Ba, the Alaska, and so on, each with its own role and destiny after death. Keeping this mess of a soul intact required a whole lot of ceremony, including the mummification process. Now, this wasn't just about preserving the body, it was about keeping the soul's connection to the physical world intact so it wouldn't get lost in the underworld. Sounds rational, right? But then you find out that they believed your heart would literally be weighed against a feather to determine your fate. Yeah, a feather. If your heart was heavier than a feather, meaning you had lived a morally unbalanced life, it was game over. Your soul would be devoured by a creature called a meat, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus. Talk about a terrifying end to the road, but if you passed, you'd be welcomed into the afterlife by Osiris, the god of the dead. It's easy to see why people might take death seriously with stakes like that. But here's where it gets insane. Pharaohs and elites spent fortunes preparing for this journey, building tombs that were bigger and more expensive than the palaces they lived in while alive. Now, let's talk about these tombs. The Great Pyramid of Giza? It wasn't just a marvel of architecture, it was the ultimate death chamber. Built over 500 years ago, it stands as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, but it's also one of the most extreme examples of how far the Egyptians went to secure their place in the afterlife. They believed that the size and complexity of the tomb directly affected a person's transition into immortality. The bigger the tomb, the smoother the journey. Makes sense, right? Except it didn't. Despite all the time, effort, and resources they poured into these massive structures, most tombs were eventually looted, and the treasures meant to guide them into the afterlife were stolen. And yet, generation after generation, they kept building. Is this the sign of a deeply spiritual society, or the symptom of a collective insanity, chasing immortality through stone and gold? What's crazier is that this obsession wasn't limited to pharaohs. Even common people went to great lengths to prepare for the afterlife, on a much smaller scale, of course. They couldn't afford pyramids, but they buried themselves with personal belongings, charms, and amulets that were supposed to protect them in the next world. Entire industries thrived on making afterlife goods, coffins, funerary masks, magical texts, each promising to offer some advantage in navigating the dangers of the underworld. You had to be ready for everything: demons, fire lakes, snakes, because apparently the afterlife was no walk in the park. But why were the Egyptians so focused on this afterlife? Was it pure faith, or were they gripped by fear, a fear of death so profound that it shaped an entire civilization's economy, politics, and culture? They spent more on death than life. That's a fact. The labor, the engineering, the craftsmanship, all aimed at ensuring that death wasn't the end, but a continuation, albeit through a twisted, terrifying version of immortality. It's not exactly the kind of heaven most people envision today. Think about it. A culture so terrified of the unknown that they mummified their pets, buried food with them for the afterlife, and filled their tombs with false doors to confuse potential grave robbers. Were they trying to protect themselves from thieves, or were they just insanely paranoid about what awaited them after death? And here's the thing, all of this, every brick in every pyramid, every linen wrapping on a mummy, was driven by a belief that the afterlife was just as real, if not more real, than life itself. But is this rational, or is it the ultimate fear-driven madness? When people talk about ancient civilizations, the usual suspects come up: Egypt, Mesopotamia, maybe even Greece. But there's one that often gets overlooked: the Indus Valley civilization. This was a society so advanced that it left behind cities with grid layouts, complex drainage systems, and even early forms of dentistry. But here's the twist: we still know shockingly little about their religious life. And yet, the clues we do have suggest something bizarre, something completely different from the polytheistic and monotheistic traditions that shaped later civilizations. The Indus Valley civilization, located in what's now Pakistan and northwest India, flourished around 2500 BCE. They built cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. But what's really fascinating isn't just the architecture, it's the silence. They left behind no grand temples, no written records detailing gods and rituals. And that raises a huge question: did they even have gods as we understand them? Or were they practicing some kind of religion that's almost unrecognizable to us today? Archaeologists have uncovered a few tantalizing clues. Seals, small carved stones, often show what looks like a horned figure sitting in a yogic posture, possibly an early form of the Hindu god Shiva. But was this figure truly a deity, or just a symbolic representation of something entirely different? Shiva is known today as both a creator and destroyer, a complex god representing life cycles, but if this is a prototype of that figure, what does it say about the Indus people's worldview? Were they worshipping life's dualities before anyone else? And then there's the so-called mother goddess figurines, plump, earthy statues that some believe represent fertility goddesses. But here's the kicker: we don't actually know. Unlike other ancient cultures that left behind detailed myths, these figurines don't come with a story. Were these symbols of divine femininity, or just representations of everyday life? Maybe they weren't even gods at all, but rather symbols of prosperity or health. It's like staring into a void of meaning. There's just not enough to go on, and that silence is eerie. What's really mind-blowing, though, is that the Indus Valley civilization seemed almost uninterested in the kind of monumental religious structures we see elsewhere. While Egypt built pyramids and Mesopotamians erected towering ziggurats to connect with their gods, the Indus people didn't bother. Their cities were organized, clean, and efficient, but where's the grand temple? Where's the divine footprint? Were these people too practical for religion as we know it, or were they worshiping something that didn't require physical symbols, something more abstract, like natural forces or the flow of life itself? And this is where things get really interesting. Were they following a path we barely recognize today? Maybe their religion was less about worshiping gods and more about maintaining balance. Look at their cities, designed with precision, reflecting a society obsessed with order. Maybe their religion wasn't about praying to gods, but about living in harmony with their environment. If that's the case, then their gods weren't in the sky or on altars. They were in the flow of the river, in the seasons, in the cycles of agriculture. But that raises another uncomfortable question. What happened to them? By 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley civilization began to decline. Was this a failure of their religious system? Did their focus on balance leave them vulnerable to the chaos of nature, floods, droughts, invasions? Were their forgotten gods unable to protect them? Or did their practical worldview fail when they faced the uncontrollable forces of the real world? What's truly insane is how this entire civilization, with its advanced technologies and enigmatic beliefs, just disappeared. And with it, their gods, or whatever form their religion took, vanished into the dust of history. Their language remains undeciphered, their temples, if they even existed, remain unfound, and their gods, if they had them, left no trace. Were these forgotten gods symbols of a society that simply refused to leave a divine footprint? Or were they practicing something so abstract, so different, that we can't even recognize it? When you think of monotheism, you probably picture modern religions like Christianity, Islam, or Judaism, right? But what if I told you that the world's first monotheistic religion wasn't any of these, it was Zoroastrianism? Yep. Thousands of years before Jesus, Muhammad, or Moses, a Persian prophet named Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, depending on who you ask, dropped a bombshell on the ancient world: one supreme god, Ahura Mazda. Sounds simple, right? Well, not quite. While Zoroastrianism is often called the first monotheistic religion, it's actually built on a dualistic worldview that's a bit more insane than you'd expect. Let's break it down. Zoroaster taught that the universe was locked in an eternal battle between good and evil, light and darkness. On one side, you've got Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the god of truth, order, and light. On the other side, Angra, the spirit of destruction, chaos, and all things evil. So was this really monotheism, or was it just dualism dressed up in religious robes? Let's be honest, Zoroastrianism wasn't just about worshiping one god, it was about picking a side in an ongoing cosmic war. It wasn't God is everything, but more like God is in a constant fight for survival. If you ask me, that's a pretty stressful religion. Imagine living your entire life in fear that chaos could win at any moment. Zoroaster didn't present Ahura Mazda as an all-powerful being who could snap his fingers and erase evil. Nope. This was a god who needed your help to defeat the darkness. Think about that for a second. A god who depends on you to make sure order triumphs over chaos. That's a heavy burden for a human to carry, right? It puts the responsibility for the universe squarely on the shoulders of believers, demanding that they live pure, moral lives just to keep the universe from falling apart. I mean, is that a divine mission or a cosmic guilt trip? And let's talk about the fire. Zoroastrians are obsessed with it. To them, fire isn't just a symbol, it's a physical manifestation of Ahura Mazda's divine light. They literally built temples to house sacred fires that had to be kept burning at all costs. No pressure, but if your fire went out, it meant you were letting the forces of chaos take over. Some of these sacred fires have supposedly been burning for thousands of years. Again, this isn't just worship, it's an endurance test. What kind of religion makes you fight entropy every single day? And this cosmic war wasn't limited to the spiritual world, it was playing out right here on Earth too. Zoroastrians believed that the choices you made in your daily life directly impacted the battle between good and evil. If you told the truth, practiced charity, and lived according to Asher, the Zoroastrian concept of truth and order, you were helping Ahura Mazda. But every lie, every act of greed or cruelty, that wasn't just a personal failing, it was literally giving Angra the upper hand. How's that for high stakes? But here's where it gets even more complicated. Zoroastrianism wasn't just about keeping your own life in order, it was about keeping the world in order too. They believed in the importance of purity in everything, from fire to water to the very earth beneath their feet. Pollution of any kind, physical or moral, was seen as an attack on creation itself. So, if you accidentally polluted a river or let a fire burn out, you weren't just making a mess, you were aiding the forces of darkness. It's no wonder this religion had rules for everything from burial rituals to waste disposal. The idea was that by keeping the material world clean and orderly, you were protecting it from Angra corrupting influence. Sounds exhausting, right? Now, you might be thinking, okay, but what's the big deal? Plenty of religions have rules about purity and morality. True, but Zoroastrianism took it to an extreme that's hard to ignore. It wasn't just about being a good person, it was about making sure the entire cosmos didn't collapse into chaos. Is this the height of spiritual responsibility, or just a recipe for paranoia? Imagine living with the belief that every misstep, every little sin could tip the balance of the universe in favor of destruction. How do you even sleep at night with that kind of pressure? And here's the kicker. Zoroastrianism didn't just influence the ancient world, it shaped the religions we know today. Some scholars argue that key concepts like heaven and hell, the final judgment, and even the battle between good and evil in Christianity and Islam have roots in Zoroastrian beliefs. So whether you realize it or not, this ancient dualistic religion has left its mark on the world. Imagine a time before written language, before agriculture, before cities. Now picture a massive, intricately built temple. Sound impossible? Well, that's exactly what Göbekli Tepe is, a site that defies everything we thought we knew about human civilization. Located in modern-day Turkey, this ancient structure is over 11,000 years old, predating even Stonehenge by 6,000 years. Yeah, you heard that right. This is a temple built by hunter-gatherers, long before humans settled into farming communities. But here's the kicker. No one knows why it was built, or who exactly built it. Göbekli Tepe is made up of massive stone pillars arranged in circular formations, with some of the stones towering up to 16 feet high and weighing several tons. These pillars are decorated with carvings of animals, everything from wild boars to lions to snakes, and abstract symbols that no one has fully deciphered. The level of artistry and engineering here is shocking. How did people who were supposed to be nomads, constantly on the move, find the time and resources to build something this massive? And more importantly, why did they? Here's where things get weird. For most of human history, we believe that religion came after agriculture, that once people settled down and had stable food sources, they built temples and developed organized religious systems. But Göbekli Tepe turns that theory upside down. It suggests that religion may have been the driving force behind civilization itself. Think about it, these hunter-gatherers were putting in the effort to gather massive stones, carve them, and arrange them into a complex temple. It's as if the need to connect with something greater than themselves was more important than food or shelter. What kind of religion was this? Was it ancestor worship? Did they believe in gods? Or were they trying to communicate with nature, the spirits of animals, or something even stranger? The fact is, we just don't know. There are no written records, no tombs, and no clear indications of what rituals were performed here. All we have are these haunting stone circles and the knowledge that something incredibly important drove these ancient people to create the world's first temple. And then there's the big mystery. Why was Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried? Yeah, you heard that right. At some point, after thousands of years of use, this incredible site was covered in tons of dirt, almost as if its creators wanted to hide it. But why? Was it no longer sacred? Was it considered dangerous? Or did these people fear the knowledge or power contained within its stones? Some archaeologists think it was buried as part of a ritual. Others believe it may have been an attempt to protect the site from invaders or natural disasters. Either way, the deliberate burial raises even more questions than it answers. Here's another thing to think about. What does Göbekli Tepe mean for the rest of human history? If hunter-gatherers were capable of building something this monumental, what else have we underestimated about ancient humans? This site is a giant question mark in our understanding of how civilization began, suggesting that spirituality, art, and community were not just byproducts of settled life. They were the foundations of it. Göbekli Tepe changes the timeline. It forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about human development. But here's the real mind-bender. Göbekli Tepe isn't just the world's oldest temple. It's the earliest evidence we have that humans were willing to come together, organize, and cooperate for something beyond survival. That something was spiritual, or at least they thought it was. What could have been so important that it pushed people to build a structure that would last for over 10,000 years? Was it a glimpse of the divine, or the first example of human obsession with the unknown? And finally, what if there's more to this story? If Göbekli Tepe was hidden for thousands of years and only discovered by accident, what else is buried out there, waiting to rewrite history once again? We might be just scratching the surface of what ancient humans were really capable of. The fact that this site even exists opens up the possibility that there's a lot we don't know and maybe never will. Thank you for sticking around until the end. We hope you found this as mind-blowing as we did. If you enjoyed this dive into ancient mysteries, be sure to hit the like button, drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Göbekli Tepe and its secrets, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. God bless, and see you in the next one.